Hello and welcome to Show and Tell with me, Stephen Leslie, from a very hot and sweaty London. This is the series where, when I can be asked, I show you some photos and then tell you about them. And this, would you believe it, coming hot on the heels of episode 22, is episode 23, because that's how sequential numbers work. And so what are we going to look at today? Well, I'm going to try and tackle one of the most prolific, and assuming that he doesn't pop his clogs between me recording this and then putting it up online, one of the longest lived photographers out there, the great and hopefully not yet late 90, actually very nearly 91 years old, Lee Freelander. So let's do the titles and then we can get stuck right in. So where the hell do you start with Lee Freelander? There is simply so much stuff out there that it can be a bit daunting. It's a bit like tackling Mount Everest, or akin to asking someone for a TV sitcom recommendation and they say to you, oh well, you have to watch It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And then you find out that there's already been 16 bloody seasons and 170 episodes. Lee Friedlander, I would say, is the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia of photographers. In 2019, he published a book called Freelander 51st, which catalogued his first 50 books. That's right, his first 50. And that was 6 years ago now. Since then, he's published at least another 7. So you can understand my trepidation when it came to making this episode. What the hell was I going to talk about? Where do I start when confronted with such a huge back catalogue? And some of these books ain't cheap, let me tell you. The one that I really wanted, which is an anthology of all his best street work, called Street, the Human Clay, is currently going for £641.99. Not just 641, but 641.99. So almost 642 over on Amazon right now, in case you want to buy it. So I very nearly gave up before I even started, but then, oh joy, last October I went to New York City, and in the Great Strand bookshop I found a copy of this, a book that was published in 2021, so it's not even in that first 50, and it was reduced from $65 to a more affordable $45.50. And it's called The People's Pictures, and it's absolutely glorious, and it's what we're going to talk about today in detail. Hooray! But before we take a look inside this book, I suppose it would be useful to give you a very quick biog type thing of Lee Freelander, just to give you a bit of context. But I promise to try and keep this short and very, very sweet. So he was born on the 14th of July, 1934 in Washington, and he started taking photographs really, really early on. And by the age of 14, he was already and effectively a working photographer and selling his photographs. Here's a fairly early photo of him from 1960 by William Claxton, which is truly glorious, and I want you to remember this photograph because we're going to come back to it and talk about it in a bit more detail later on. Anyway, Lee Freelander is primarily known for working in black and white, but I have a real fondness for some very early colour photos that he took of jazz musicians. Freelander is a massive jazz nut, and he took these from the mid-1950s onwards through to about the mid-70s, and some of them were even used as Blue Note record sleeves. There's a great shot here of Miles Davis in 1969, Aretha Franklin in 1968, and he even took the iconic cover photo for John Coltrane's Giant Steps. But these photos, lovely though they are not what Freelander is mainly associated with, which is black and white, street and documentary work. In 1967, he was included in John Sarkowski's seminal New Documents exhibition at MoMA in New York, alongside his good friends Gary Winogrand and Diane Arbus. And ever since then, he's been a central figure in photography, churning out book after book after book. And many of these books are thematically linked projects drawn from his vast archive. So among just a few of the subjects he's tackled are signs, dogs, work, pickup trucks, and even chain link fences. But the book I want to concentrate on today is this one, The People's Pictures, which was only published in 2021, and the reason that I love it so is because it deals with a subject that really floats my boat, which is photographs of people taking photographs. Now, those of you with very long memories might remember that way back in Show and Tell episode 3, I spent a lot of time looking at this great photo by Marc Rebu, taken in Japan in 1958, which I still think is probably the greatest photograph ever taken of people taking photographs. But back then I didn't know about Freelander's book, which contains some real corkers. So let's plunge in and take a detailed look. The book starts with a quote, which seems to be his usual format from what I can tell. Freelander never really puts much text into his books at all, but there almost always seems to be some kind of opening quote related to the photographs, and that's about it. So here we have a quote from The Hanging Garden by Patrick White, which simply reads, "We left in too much of a hurry, and Mama says photographs become in time so much sentimental trash." And that's it. I have no real idea what that has to do with photographs that follow. It's very obtuse. Maybe if you know, you can put an answer in the comments. Thank you very much. That would be very helpful. It's worth stating that Freelander is notoriously vague and non-committal when it comes to talking about his own photography. There really are very few interviews and lectures out there, especially when you consider that he's now in his 90s. He prefers to let his photographs speak for themselves and for people like me to possibly misinterpret them. Then we come to this photo, which is also the back cover of the book, taken at Mount Rushmore in 1969, which is brilliant, and also from another of his famous books, Monuments. Freelander is never afraid to recycle at all. Many of the photographs in the people's pictures also appear in his other books. But this is such a great, clever photo though, using this reflection, which includes the iconic mountain, but simultaneously diminishes it and reduces it to a supporting role. Also, I have no idea what kind of camera the photographer, the person in the photo, is using. So again, if you know, please feel free to leave an answer in the comments. There's also a very good trivia game that can be played with this book, which is to identify the cameras wherever possible. The next photo is from Florence, Italy in 1982, so an American monument, and then to an Italian building where the photographer is standing in the fountain, anything to get the shot, also with another unidentifiable camera. And then there's this one from New York City in 1971, which also contains a sign and is just a great people shot. It's one of those where if this woman here with the big afro was also facing the camera, it would be almost perfect. And then this one from Cape Cod in 1965 is just magnificent. Not only do we have the woman on the left shooting a Kodak Brownie Super 27 camera, but we've also got the bloke to the right holding two toffee apples. Presumably he's her partner, either that or he's just very greedy. And then between them, there's this woman in the background out in her curlers. So this is just a top-notch street photograph. And as you go through the book, there are obvious little extra themes and links, a bit like Easter eggs. So we get not one, not two, but three different photos of people taking photos while carrying children on their shoulders. Children who get older and older as we go along. Sadly, it's only really possible to tell the make of the camera in this third photo, where it's a Canon Auto Boy 2, which I think is the same camera as the one in this photograph taken in New Orleans in 1991. And it's fascinating to me to track the passage of time in these photos through both fashion and also cameras. So as I mentioned, the earliest photograph in this book is from 1957, and it's this one, taken in Washington DC, and the hats and the suits reflect that time. But also the photographer here is using an early Argus C3 rangefinder to take a photograph of what I'm fairly sure is Martin Luther King there, which means that this photographer here has got himself into a much better position than Lee Friedlander, who was just 23 at the time. And then we jump ahead to this photograph from New York in 2016. So a full 59 years later, and now no one is wearing a suit or a hat, and the photographer is shooting a digital Canon EOS. And there really can't be many projects that chart the passage of time so effectively. The only other one I can think of is André Cortez's On Reading, which spans 1915 to 1980, so 65 years. But the crucial difference here is that books will always remain the same. Cortez died before we got Kindles or phones, so it's just physical books and newspapers in his project. The people's fashions would have changed a bit, but not the books. Freelander, however, shows us how cameras have evolved as well, so that's another added little extra element. So this photo from Washington in 1988 is just great precisely because it captures a very specific time in history. This photo just screams the 1980s at us, and it was taken in 1988, which we can tell from the clothes, the haircuts, and the camera, which is a 110 format camera. I tried having a quick look to figure out exactly which make of 110 camera this was, but then I got incredibly bored and gave up. Incidentally, 110 cameras always look good in photographs. There's this great one by Thomas Hackenberg from 1991, of a Hanimex TF being held together with an elastic band, and which is also brilliantly augmented by the woman in the background's sunglasses. But coming back to Freelander's photo, whatever the make, it's a corker, and it's given an extra layer of significance by the fact that the girl and her friends are standing here in front of another national monument in Washington DC, even though that's not what's being photographed. And what is being photographed? Well, we'll never know. And this is a detail that's really interesting to me because the photographs in this book can be broken down into roughly 3 distinct categories. First off, there are photographs where Freelander's photo shows you both the photographer and their subject. So the photograph we looked at a moment ago of Martin Luther King, that photographer is clearly taking a photo of Martin Luther King, or at least the back of the head of the bloke standing right in front of Martin Luther King. But this is probably the smallest group in the book. A few others include this one from Rapid City in 1969, where the dinosaur is quite obviously the subject, or this one here from 1975 in New Orleans, where Freelander is taking a photo of a man taking a group family portrait, presumably his family, whilst both Freelander and also this bloke here in a really great hat watches on. It's maybe also worth quickly pointing out that the best and most arch example of this is the one we briefly looked at earlier, the Mount Rushmore photo, where the subject is reflected in glass. It's such a banger, this one, that I'm going to show to you again. But my absolute favourite photograph in this category is an utterly baffling one from Alaska in 1988. So the same year as that girl with the 110 camera in Washington we looked at just a second ago, Freelander also photographed this one, which shows a man in his vest in what looks like a very cramped kitchen or possibly even a trailer home, photographing 15 very large clams. Possibly they're Pacific razor clams. They're definitely mollusks, while this bloke in an Othello gun club cap watches on. In fact, he's actually got one of the large bivalves in his hand, modelling it, as it were. This is such a great, bizarre photo. If it was in colour, then you would swear it was by Jeff Mermelstein. It looks almost exactly like something out of No Title Here, which was Mermelstein's second book. And I'm definitely stretching a bit, but I really love the way that the photographer's vest here looks a bit like a clam's protruding foot. But that's enough of that, because there are 2 more types of image that dominate this book. The next group is photographs where we don't know what the photographer was photographing at all. Look at this one from New York City in 1975. This man is doing a fantastic contortion to make sure his Leica gets the shot of what? No idea. It might be some kind of parade, but we'll never know. The only record is the long-lost photograph itself and Freelander's photo that preserves the photographer but not their subject. This is a great transformational trick to turn another photographer into his subject while still maintaining an unanswerable element of mystery. And it's something that Freelander does again and again throughout this great book. So this one from San Francisco in 1986. Here on the left we have another type of 110 camera. This time it's a Kodak, but it's not photographing the smoking woman with a load of plastic fruit in her head right next to him. And neither is the other woman with another camera on the other side of her. So what are both these people photographing? We just don't know. Or this one. Holy shit, this is great. Look at these women in New Orleans in 1970 with their sunglasses. What I love about this one is you can't really see any eyes in this photograph. It's all about lenses, either glass lenses or camera lenses, and again, the clothes and hairstyles and cameras all perfectly describe a moment in time. But again, we don't know what it was that caught their eyes, the eyes that we can't see. I'm also crazy about this photo, also taken in New Orleans, 2 years later in 1972. Because this is both a photograph of a man photographing something else, but we'll never know what, but it's also a photograph of a German Shepherd dog trying unsuccessfully to hump another smaller dog, but getting the ends completely mixed up. The photographer here has completely missed this thing taking place right under his nose, unless of course he's photographing some better dog-based porn right in front of him, but I doubt that. Freelander, though, as someone who knows his onions, has managed to get both dog sex and photography in his frame, and a bonus point too for this guy just watching the canine cock up. So we've got photographs where we can see the subject, we've got photographs where we can see the photographer but we'll never know what the subject was, and there's one final group of photographs that this book contains, which is photographs where the subject is, that's right, Lee Freelander. Take a look at this one from San Francisco in 1986. Now there's quite clearly a parade or something similar going on as all these people are gathered to look at something, but Freelander has spotted a photographer who again I think is using a Canon Autoboy 2, and the photographer and his companion have also definitely busted Freelander, and so the resulting photograph is a kind of quid pro quo transaction. So here we know what the photograph is going to be of. It's going to be of Lee Freelander taking your photo. How cool is that? And there are loads of these. Look, here's David Hockney in 1974 in New York City, smoking, of course, while about to, or having just snapped Freelander with his Rolly 35. What do we call this category of photograph? They're not quite self-portraits, although of course Freelander is no stranger to the self-portrait. In fact, it's one of his most well-known signature styles. Remember I showed you First 50 early on? Well, the front cover of that was a slightly creepy self-portrait in a mask, and it's definitely meant to evoke his first ever book, which he described as a book nobody would ever touch, by which he meant no publisher, and he self-published, which was called Self-Portrait. So it was a self-published self-portrait book, and it came out in 1970, so 55 years ago. And that book is nothing but self-portraits, although all of these, whether reflections or shadows, are of Freelander. None of them, yet, are of other people photographing him. But I find it fascinating that in his introduction to that book, he actually reveals a bit about his thought process. It was his first book, remember, so he hadn't yet earned a reputation or isn't yet trying to be as arch and as sly as he would eventually become. It's also worth considering that if you look at the first books of a couple of other great photographers, then they are incredibly, almost impossibly ambitious. Think of Walker Evans' American Photographs, or Robert Frank's The Americans. These are books that attempt to capture an entire nation at a certain point in history. That's why they include America in their titles. Nothing so lofty with Lee Freelander. His first book is just a goofy book of self-portraits, but arguably his photographic career and legacy has gone on to eclipse both Evans and Frank, certainly in terms of longevity and sheer number of books published. Anyway, in the introduction to Self-Portrait, Freelander writes of these photographs that they began as straight portraits, but soon I was finding myself at times in the landscape of my photography. I might call myself an intruder. At first, my presence in my photos was fascinating and disturbing, but as time passed and I was more a part of other ideas in my photos, I was glad to add a giggle to those feelings. I love the idea of intrusion, and it's one that these photographs absolutely reinforce. Freelander is intruding into the landscape of other photographers, but they are also intruding into his landscape, and it's all done in a great playful spirit, with a giggle, as he brilliantly puts it. If you remember at the start of this film, I showed you this photograph of Freelander taken in 1960 by William Claxton, so when Freelander was just 26 years old. And I have a theory about this photo. I think that everyone has a single photo where they look their best, and it's usually is one taken when you're quite young. And I would speculate that in Freelander's case, this is that photograph. He just looks as cool as fuck with the hat and the cigarette. And I think Freelander knew this, because since then he's made absolutely no effort at all to look good in any of his self-portraits. Look at this one, lounging about in his pants. Or this one. He just doesn't care. Ever since that one cool William Claxton shot, Freelander would rather photograph himself as a shadow, or as he's got older in his pants again, or at the dentist, or even in 2011 when he was in intensive care and nearly died, hooked up to a life support machine. Now, I've spent a lot of time praising this book, and I do absolutely love it, and I think it's fantastic, but I should point out that the book is actually divided into two separate parts. The first section, as we've just seen, is all about photographers, people taking pictures, but there is a second half. It's almost equally split, and I would love to tell you that the second half of this book revealed the very photographs taken by all the people, all those other photographers in Lee Freelander's photographs, so we could see exactly what they were photographing. That would be truly astonishing, wouldn't it? I think if he'd done that, this would be one of the greatest photography books ever. And you know, he could have done it. He could have run up to every person in the first half immediately after taking his photo of them taking their photo, so they could swap details, and then he could have got their photos back from them later on. But alas, that's not what we get. What we get in the second half are some other great photos, but they are just any photos with images and other photos in them. So stuff like this. And you can see, and the photograph here on the book's cover, and a few more conventional self-portraits, some of which were also originally first published way back in 1970 in Freelander's first book, Self-Portrait, which we talked about just earlier. There is, however, one photograph I've been able to find that sort of scratches the itch of that exchange that I've just fantasized about, although it's not in this book. In 2002, Freelander had his portrait taken by the late great Richard Aendon. Here it is. Freelander seems to be rocking a Hasselblad there. And when that photograph was taken, Freelander took his reciprocal one of Aendon and his team. It looks like he's using an 8x10 Deerdorf. Although I wish that Aendon had taken Freelander's photo just as he was taking that photo. But he didn't, and there's nothing I can do about that now, and so I'll shut up and stop complaining. There's just one final thing that this book made me think about, and I'm not sure if it's entirely relevant, but I think it's quite funny, so I'm going to mention it anyway. Years and years ago, I remember watching an interview on TV with Gibby Haynes. Now, if you don't know who Gibby Haynes is, he's not a photographer, as far as I know, but he's in fact the lead singer with a group called the Butthole Surfers. If you know them, then you'll know what they're like and what to expect. If you don't know them, then brace yourselves. Anyway, in that interview, Gibby Haynes talks about what he imagines would be the most intense thing you could possibly do. And he comes up with this.
Yeah, if you could only like tear out one eyeball and place it looking directly into your other eyeball, you would probably encounter an intense form of video feedback that would probably like
left brain, right brain,
unleash outrageous emotional meanderings.
And now, when I watch that clip and think about it, I like to think that in a way that's what Lee Freelander was going after here in the first section of the People's Pictures, when he took all those photographs of people photographing him. That if he could somehow get his hands on those photographs and put them next to each other so that one eyeball, as it were, could look directly back into the other eyeball, then he and we, the viewers, might experience an intense form of video feedback that would probably like unleash outrageous emotional meanderings. And that is as good a place as any to end before my own outrageous meanderings get too emotional. Thanks for watching. If you haven't yet got a copy of my own book, which is called Mostly False Reports, then please consider grabbing one. You can get one from the website. And yeah, thanks for watching. That was Lee Freelander, and I'll try and do another one of these soon. Thanks and goodbye.